So, Dr. Jeremy Lipschultz, professor and founder of the UNO, University of Nebraska Omaha Social Media Lab at the University of Nebraska Omaha. Jeremy, take it away.
Thank you, Valerie. We began looking at Twitter data specifically as part of a social media metrics class back in 2010. So I guess I'm the old guy on the program, but it eventually led to a social media lab with a number of interdisciplinary faculty members. Part of what I see is Twitter as communication behavior and perhaps the largest data set in the history of humans. And so as part of this, we've been tracking Warren Buffett and the Berkshire Hathaway annual meeting, which was last week here in Omaha. We've been doing that for about 10 years, specifically using such tools as NodeXL and Meltwater, and more recently now, Sprinkler. The lab tracks the reach over time, and we think it's particularly important when you look at this to look at social media events. And one of the things that the Sprinkler data shows us here is that a large chunk of the data appear in two sources, and that is Twitter and beyond that, news sources. And that's important validation that we can then take to both Sprinkler and NodeXL. We're looking at social capital and thought leadership, and particularly looking for the appearance of trust within these social media data sets. Now within NodeXL, and I would just direct you to the Pew Internet 2014 article that Mark Smith and the Social Media Research Foundation did at that time. And there are basically 6 structures that one can look at within these social networks, and that can allow us to do some simple machine coding, which allows us to kind of then look at the imagery of Buffett and his fans and followers as they appear. And so you can see these interrelationships of thought leadership with people who were present last week at the annual meeting, such as Tim Cook, for example, Bill Gates, etc., who are also active on Twitter. So what do you do with this? One of the things that we were interested in this year was, Buffett and his colleague Charlie Munger spend hours up on the stage answering questions and talking about sort of the state of Berkshire Hathaway, but more broadly the state of American society and the economy. And if anybody's been following this, the Bitcoin debate, Buffett has become sort of a flashpoint in that as kind of a curmudgeon to sort of dispute Bitcoin and kind of the blockchain developments of NFT and the like. Well, what I wanted to look at, first of all, was sort of the global reach of the conversation, but then to compare Sprinkler and NodeXL output, because, we've been so NodeXL focused that it's interesting, and we did this a bit with Meltwater before too, to try to see what is happening. In the case of NodeXL, we've got public science, open source algorithms and the like. And what we found obviously was that Bitcoin did emerge, in the Warren Buffett search for both data analysis platforms. What I thought was intriguing about this was we also tracked the official Berkshire Hathaway hashtag BRK 2022, and what you see here at the bottom right hand is that here the conversation is quite different, less about things like Bitcoin and the issues in the conversation, and more about Omaha and kind of Warren Buffett himself and the Berkshire Hathaway company. So this raises a lot of research questions in terms of tracking comprehensively the nature of particularly Twitter data and the ability, I guess, to treat it as a relevant artifact of social media conversation. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Jeremy. Awesome. All right, next we have Dr. Lance Porter, Professor, Communication Department, and founding director of the SMAC Lab. You know you wanted me to pronounce that way. The Social Media Analysis and Creation Lab at LSU.
Lance, are you unmuted?
Apologies, y'all. I've been having computer problems this morning and they continue. So, second. I have problems sharing my screen. So, oh, there we go. So, okay, sorry guys. So what let's see, that's paused. I'm getting a pause. I'm sorry, I'm getting a my screen sharing is paused, but it won't let me resume my share. So I'm just going to speak. What we set out to do a couple of years ago.
Lance, would you like to share your screen? I think we have time, and I think what happened was because you arrived a little late. Maybe I didn't get your permission set right. So do you want to try again? Because I just changed your permissions.
Okay, sorry, that's totally on me. Let me try that again. There we go. That looks like it should. Okay, you guys see that now? Thanks for bearing with me.
Yeah.
We can.
All right.
So we had kind of similar to Jeremy. I've been in the game for a while, doing these kinds of social media analytics with everything from Radian 6 to Crimson Hexagon to Brandwatch to now Sprinkler. And so I've got some experience working with these things. But one of those fruitful conversations with a political scientist was like, well, how do you know who these people are and what they do? And so we sort of set out to set up this partnership between the SMAC Lab, and we have a public policy research center within the School of Mass Communications at LSU who does survey research, extensive survey research. And so we came up with this idea to do a combination of both methods. So we would actually use a Qualtrics panel to pay people to take a survey, an extensive survey around their political behavior, their personality types, race, gender, all those kinds of things. And then we also would pay them a little extra if they would allow us access to their social media data. And so that created a database, as you can see here, of around 1,000 people, close to 1,000 people, with around 10 years worth of data. And that allowed us to run a bunch of different types of studies on this. And actually, these are all sort of in process. But the main overall findings that we found, just in general, that we kind of started with was we did topic modeling on all this data. And we found that the four main ways that things that people were communicating about on Twitter were entertainment, politics, live casting, and promotion. And then we were able to look at who was speaking on those topics, what were they about, how did they fluctuate over the years? And by the way, politics was never more than 2% of the total conversation on Twitter during that time, even in an election year, which kind of shocked us as a big finding. And then life casting, sharing what you had for lunch was kind of one of those things that really started out big on Twitter and then doesn't happen as much anymore as that behavior sort of moved to other platforms. And so we have a lot of different things going on, different types of studies, just to kind of give you a sampling of what we have. Is we have our first thing we published was, does people, what they say they do on social media in a survey, does that equal what they actually do? Because we had their behavior to look at. And the answer was yes, except at the extremes. People who said that they were on Twitter all the time, posting all the time, they tend to overestimate what they actually do. And at the other end of the extreme, people that say that they don't ever do anything on Twitter, they do. They actually do produce some things. And so, but in the middle, it was kind of, there was that agreement. So we have other things in process, a whole paper on digital participation. We've got a paper on second screening behavior around entertainment behavior that's coming out in Journal of Communication Technology. And then we've done several pieces that we've got in process on Latinx Twitter, looking at that. And that's certainly a much more complex study to be able to, you can't really categorize that. That's sort of the point of that study, is that you can't categorize Latinx Twitter in the same way that you can Black Twitter. So those are just some ideas. We probably have a dozen different projects coming at this from different angles, and we hope to get some more money to relaunch the study in the future. Thank you.
Great, thank you, very cool. And then our last but not least, arguably, or maybe inarguably, most important, Dr. Brandon Boatwright, Assistant Professor in the Department of Communication and Director of the Social Media Listening Center at Clemson, who is going to talk about ethics.
Awesome. Thank you, Valerie. And now with that setup, I'm a little afraid.
The pressure.
of letting everyone down.
Yeah.
No, so let me go ahead and pull up my screen. Whoops. Let's see this one. There we go. Make that full screen for you all. All right, so I do have the luxury of talking about social media research ethics this morning. I noticed that there were questions about that coming in, and wanted to kind of take a personal note to address some of those questions as part of this talk as well. There's a lot to talk about with social media and research ethics, and I want to start just by kind of sharing a funny story. I've been the director of the Social Media Listening Center for a few years now, but I've worked in this space for quite a while. Previously, probably back in 2014, I was giving a demonstration of our space, and we had a visualization of the conversation that was happening around Clemson University to prospective undergraduate students who were visiting campus with their parents. And part of the visualization was a real-time, inflow of tweets that were coming in. I started the presentation, was giving a conversation, and I noticed that one of the parents and one of the prospective students were getting into a little bit of a squabble. And I overheard the parent saying, "That's your tweet. That's your handle." And I caught a quick glimpse of it, and the tweet was from this person who said, "Going to visit Clemson with my parents, #FML." I'm not sure if you're familiar with the hashtag. I'm not going to, or the acronym, I'm not going to say it because this is being recorded. But it was interesting to see that real time, we were collecting these conversations and seeing these images pop up, these conversations pop up. And that had a bit of a negative effect for that prospective student. I didn't follow up to check to see if they actually came. Would be interesting to know that now in retrospect. But this all raises some interesting questions about social media research particularly within the context of data analytics, data scraping, and things of that nature. So I want to talk briefly about some of the ethical considerations in social media research. And again, I know that there's a lot to cover with this, and there's no way to possibly do that in a 5-minute talk. I chose this cover because it is a messy concept. It is a messy topic to talk about. There is no clear-cut standard approach to handling ethical issues in social media research. However, I do want to turn everyone's attention to an article that was written by Leanne Townsend and Claire Wallace in 2016, and I'll share a link to that article in just a few minutes, that highlights some of the key concerns associated with social media research. And they essentially boil down to 4 things. The discrepancy or the difference between public versus private domain, right? One of the things that I often tell my students is, we don't pull a lot of data from Facebook and Instagram because those platforms have more stringent privacy settings. But a lot of students and a lot of people in general don't really understand that some social media platforms are public until you make them private, like Twitter. So this distinction between the public and private space and whether data is publicly accessible, like a Twitter conversation around a hashtag, or a private Facebook group, for instance. Where do we draw the lines within those conversations? Informed consent is also an important piece of any human subjects research. I've done work where I have reached out to specific users to see if doing interviews with them is something that they would be open and amenable to doing. And again, documenting that informed consent and having a process for that is really important. Anonymity is also really important as well. For my dissertation research, I looked at conversations around anthem protests with prominent athletes. And I did a social network analysis of key influencers. Those key influencers were public individuals. And because of their participation, were no longer private, right? Their influence kind of made them more visible in that space. And then finally, the reduction of harm. We have to take into consideration the fact that some of the people that we're pulling data from may not be actually 18 years old, may not be in those terms and conditions and fitting all of those criteria, or may not be of sound mind to be posting information, and we have to consider those types of things. So again, this is a very quick kind of scratching the surface. I'm already at 5 minutes, so if you're talking about how much we could talk about this, literally there are a million different directions, and I look forward to having those conversations with you in the discussion.
Thank you so much for giving us an overview of some of the key issues in the ethical considerations of social media research. We have some time now for questions of any of the panelists.